How's going guys, welcome to the channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto becomes the Dark Dracul and got Harem? Huge shout out to the Demon King Naruto for this story. If you wants to see awesome fanfiction like this, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's get into the video. In the world of Machi where demons reign supreme, a world ruled by only those that hold supreme power and authority over the trillions of Machi's denizens. There lived a countless variety of demons varying from race to race. Some born with barely the minimal amount of power to survive the harsh and cruel life that was of a demon, while others were born with the power to reign over all those below them with an iron fist. Machi was not like the realm of the ninja or mankind where humans were led like sheep by a government of bickering politicians without a way to even think for themselves. Machi was a world meant only for the strong. It was a literal dog-eat-dog world, and those that couldn't survive either submit to their superiors or die like a dog and be left to rot. It was the way Machi worked, and because of this way of life many demons have trained and honed their skills to become the predators and not the prey to the more vicious and ferocious demons out there. However, among these demons a select few have stood out among all others, and their presence has made ripples in the sands of time for more than countless millennia. These rare few species of demons have been ones who have earned their place as the strongest among the countless other races. First was the werewolf species, a beast that walked like a man but had the instincts of a demonic wolf. Their jaw alone could rip through the flesh, bone and marrow of anything that is unlucky enough to get trapped in their mighty jaws. Their speed, strength, reflexes were so high it was rare for anyone to even fight them on even footing, especially during the full moon when their potential and power is at their highest. It was also said this race was the result of a curse by the goddess of the sun Amaterasu for a past mistake of the werewolf's ancestor, desecrating her shrine and priestess, thus enraging the goddess, and had cursed the man who then became the first werewolf in history. But nonetheless their power was not to be taken lightly. Then came the second race, a species that were called the kitsun, a race of humanoid kitsun of whom held enough powers to be called the legendary second among the strongest demonic race. Most people thought their powers were situated with only the elemental attribute for fire and illusions. Yet they could not be even more farther from the truth, cause a true elder kitsun, who has awakened most of their power, had the power to reshape the world. Besides their supernatural speed, reflexes, and strength at once achieving the final tale of Kitsun, dwarfed the strength of a werewolf who was influenced by the moon by 1,000 times, and even then the truly most gifted of Kitsun were blessed with the innate ability to wield supernatural powers that could reshape or destroy worlds. And even be blessed by the goddess Inari with the knowledge of a deity, though some were quick to dismiss that as a myth. Overall the Kitsun were a race one does not trifle with without fully comprehending the magnitude of what they're facing. The werewolf was the third in power to them, as the kitsun was in a whole other level compared to them. However, it was the final race that beckoned the call of complete power and demanded absolute obedience and authority of their kinsmen. This race was one that was older than time itself and had existed long before history. This race was known solely by one name, the vampires. Demons whose powers once awakened were at the top. Their speed, strength, reflexes, instincts and senses were so strong that none could even compare to their physical abilities. The vampires were a race that thrived in battle and lived off the blood of their victims, but held a sense of nobility that separated them from the other savage demons of Machi. Their power alone was said to be legendary, as some called them the harbingers of darkness. Even if surrounded by an entire battalion of kitsun, a true elder vampire could kill them all off without a scratch on their body. They were special, as well as their noble stature had made them particularly independent to other demons, but as time passed they as a whole race separated into vampire noble families that soon fought over influence of land in Machi and let their power known through combat to show their superiority to a rival house. Their power, however, was still a mystery even to themselves, as their power did not originate from a deity who blessed them or a curse that came from a wrathful goddess. No one truly knew what their full power was or of their origins, only that their presence had been a part of Machi since the first great war in ancient times. However, on one night, on October 10th, the world of Machi shall forever be shaken by the awakening of a true living breathing nightmare. Europe forgotten castle. She didn't know long she'd been running, perhaps it had been minutes or maybe even an hour. Time just seemed to fly by as she was chased by a group of assassins sent to kill her. Long pink hair flowed through the air as a little girl no older than maybe 5 or 6 ran down the old forsaken hallways of the old castle she had stumbled into. Big round emerald eyes looked back fearfully as she sped forward, desperately looking for a way to escape her pursuers. She didn't know how she got into this situation. The first thing she remembered was being with her mama and papa, taking a stroll through the forests of the outskirts of a nearby city. Then they disappeared and she soon found that she was being chased by these assassins. Not having awakened her vampire blood as of yet, the young girl couldn't defend herself and had to escape the clutches of her would-be killers. You may be wondering who this little girl was and who she was exactly. Well, her name was Akasha, Bloodriver, heiress to the Bloodriver family and next in line to inherit the blood of Lord Shinso. The fact that her parents had been publicizing her inheritance to all of Machi was bound to give her many enemies. She never understood why, but her parents always seemed to not be looking at her, but through her, as if looking at something in the far distance and trying so hard to reach it. Using her by any means to publicize her family's nobility, but now after all this time they disappear on her and she's attacked by assassins. It didn't matter, all that mattered right now was to survive. She fled and ran as fast as her little legs would allow her to, and soon she found a ruined castle in the middle of the forest, as if it had been attacked and eroded by weather for years. She couldn't hesitate and ran straight inside, hopefully to try and elude her trackers. It hadn't worked, and thus she found herself trying to escape them and quickly coming to exhaustion, and with only adrenaline and her willpower keeping her going, the little girl found the only small chance she had left to escape them. She took a quick turn and into a dark chamber. She never saw the giant statue of a man above the chamber's entrance, tangled up in snakes with spikes impaling him into the wall. Her pursuers found her trail leading into the dark chamber and followed her scent within. They never knew this would be their last night on the hunt, for soon the predators would become the prey. Chamber Tomb. Now when Akasha entered the chamber, she was barely able to see within the pitch black darkness, but thanks to the cracks and holes in the castle, she could see the moon's brilliant radiance shining through. Because of this, she was able to quickly run deeper into the chamber, which seemed to be getting colder and more dark the farther she delved inside. However, soon fear settled in and apprehension flooded her body as she ran through the last entranceway and into a closed-off chamber. Looking around frantically, Akasha saw no other means to escape, so when she looked back at the entrance and quickly ran and began to push the doors with all she had before they gave way and slowly closed, which she prayed hopefully gave her enough time. Scanning the room again though, Akasha soon learned a few things as her adrenaline began to ease up. 1. The chamber in fact did not look like a chamber at all, but like some sort of tomb she'd seen in the many history books she's read as a child. Statues of gargoyles and other manner of beasts and demons decorated the outer rim of the tomb, while running along the middle was a long silk crimson carpet that had seen better days. Then her eyes traveled further along the carpet and soon her emerald eyes widened incredibly. It was a coffin, a black metal coffin on the floor at the very other end of the room, which led up to a few stairs to get to the coffin. Her curiosity getting the better of her and caution being thrown out the window, Akasha walked forth, ignoring how the wind seemed to howl louder among the castle's outer walls. Her eyes were almost transfixed upon the black coffin as she made her way towards it, only to stop as she saw a small pedestal just below the coffin. Though her understanding of Machi language was superb for her age from all the teaching drilled into her by her teachers at her home, this language was far different from what she was used to. It was old, that was for certain, but she was able to make out what it said. Letting her small fingers roam the metal plaque, she let her scan the ancient scriptures and soon started to speak aloud what the text detailed. Here lies in sleep he who came before us, the one who rose from the depths of the abyss and cloaked in the everlasting embrace of darkness. The one who brought the night and shrouded the realm of Machi in eternal blackness. He who slayed kings and emperors and felled gods and the founding father of our very race. May his name echo for eternity and bring death and despair to all of his enemies. Let his name be remembered as the forefather of our entire species. Sleep well, my master, Lord Dracul. Akasha's face crunched up in confusion at the name, Lord Dracul. Why did that name sound so familiar to her? Looking back up to the coffin, Akasha slowly walked towards it and let her eyes roam the top of it as her hand glided over it. Then her eyes found a strange sigil in the middle of the coffin, and her eyes looked upon the sigil with complete and utter confusion. Her knowledge of ancient demonic sigils were at best a novice, but that sigil. Is that a seal? As her hand inched closer to the sigil, she felt her body become more nervous as her heart thumped wildly in her chest, and just as she was mere inches away from touching it. Bang. We've found you, girl. Akasha's eyes widened in fright, but before she could move, immense pain flashed from her shoulder, causing her to look down to see a long slice going through her shoulder. Looking up, Akasha saw her first attack swung blade only or another token at her and took her arms and pinned her. They never saw Akasha's blood splash over the coffin and some landing directly on the demonic sigil. Now to do what we were hired to do, nothing personal, kid, but your parents really are desperate enough to even give their own flesh and blood as a gift to a higher lord to further themselves in society. The masked assassin said, shocking the young girl on the spot who couldn't utter a single word as the man's words hit her like a freight train. Her parents organized this. They wanted her to be given as a gift to another for their own personal gain. She bowed her head as the shock was too much for her to bear, and as the assassin pulled out some rope to tie her up, only they missed the sigil on the coffin start to glow a faint purple. Then it crackled. Bzzzt. Hearing the sudden sound, the assassin about to tie up the young vampire looked to the source only to see a sigil on the coffin crackling with black and purple lighting as it gave off a violet glow. A feeling of apprehension started to crawl up the assassin's spine, which only grew to nervousness when the coffin started to let loose a menacing shroud of black fog. "What is this?" cried another assassin as the fog started to envelop the entire chamber. Seeing the fog, Akasha was shaken from her shocked state to see the fog emanating from the coffin, and her eyes widened when she saw the sigil crackling with bolts of black and purple lightning. Unlike the assassins though, Akasha felt a sense of familiarity wash over as the fog started to condense and a dark oppressive aura flooded the chamber. Then it happened. The next sound sent a cold chill down the spines of every living being in the chamber. The sigil burst into flames of red, purple, black and green before it disappeared, and as the silence lengthened it happened. Pre-Ayak. To the fear and apprehension of the assassins and fascination of Akasha, they watched as the coffin's lid started to open, letting waves of the black fog to flood the chamber like a tsunami. Idly, Akasha soon noticed the moon's white light had turned blood red, and the sky from the holes of the castle walls was pure black. Her eyes went back to the coffin as the lid slid over the coffin before it hit the ground with a loud thump, but then to the growing horror and fascination a hand rose to grasp the edges of the coffin. The hand was deathly pale, wrinkled and bony with nails yellow as if stained in blood, but they looked rather menacing. Then the corpse within arose, and what was revealed induced true terror into the very heart and soul of every assassin within that chamber, but strangely, the 5-year-old Akasha felt that overwhelming sense of familiarity strengthen along with a feeling of awe. The body or corpse was pale as death, its physique was thin without a shred of muscle, revealing most of his upper body bones underneath his pasty white flesh. It was clearly a man, but the sheer appearance was absolutely horrific. For the man's hair was long and grey, his face was sunken in as his lips seemed dried up, and his gasp of breath was shallowed and dried up. Then the corpse somehow snapped its head in their direction, and his eyes were finally revealed. A shade of scarlet, so bloodthirsty and savage taste of hunger, were as clear as day, but black slits were what pinned the assassins on the spot, thus paralyzing them in complete primal fear. With his face clearly shown, Ho's nose was sunken in as well, giving him a rather abnormal appearance. Then the man spared a glance to pink-haired Akasha and eyed her for only a moment before it looked back at the assassins. Then its dried lips widened before the man's mouth widened incredibly to reveal a jaw of razor-sharp fangs. Then the corpse shot out before the assassins could even move, then a grunt sounded before a gurgling sound broke them of their stupor. They turned to see the corpse biting into the neck of their fellow assassin, sucking his blood, greedily causing the assassin body to shrivel up. Then with their fellow assassin's limp body and the monster's abnormally large fangs, it turned its sights on them. Then it pounced. For Akasha, she had never in all her short life witnessed such bloodshed, as her attackers' pleas and cries were muffled as by the sounds of flesh torn and gouging of blood, flesh, and crunching of bones. The savage scene caused her eyes to dilate, and before she knew what happened, she found herself staring into the crimson eyes of the corpse. Then her vision went dark. Next morning. Akasha truly had never felt so comfortable. It was as if she was sleeping on a cloud. She hummed peacefully into her blanket and sunk deeper into the soft bed below her. Wait, blanket. Bed. Emerald eyes snapped open only to close as the young girl, as the sun's rays through the red curtains caused her grunt before she threw the blanket over her head to try to block out the sun. She let out a grumble before let her eyes come back out from under the blankets and let them adjust to the light. Slowly as her eyes adjusted, Akasha surveyed her surroundings before she grasped her head as memories of the night before hit her. Running away from the assassins, the castle, the chamber, the coffin, the news of her parents' betrayal, then the corpse. But then Akasha looked again at her surroundings. Where was she? This wasn't her bedroom, that was for certain, but this couldn't have been the same castle she was in last night. The castle had been in complete ruins and utterly unlivable for anyone, and yet she was inside a bedroom furnished with so many things that she had never seen before. In fact, how did she even end up in bed like this? All she remembered was glowing blood-red slit eyes before her vision went dark. Slowly Akasha slid off the bed, letting her feet touch the cold wood floor, causing her to let out a hiss before she looked at herself to see that she was still wearing her clothing from last night, but the wound she remembered getting was completely gone, as if it had never even happened. Running a hand through her long pink hair, Akasha looked at the door to the room and nervously stepped toward it. She was curious to find out what happened and where she was and where the man from the coffin had went. So opening the door, Akasha was welcomed to a sight that brought her to a state of complete awe, as once again she was flabbergasted by the sheer size of the castle she was in. The walls stood tall as decor of all kinds decorated the hallway she was in, from metal suits of knights to paintings of great battles to strange demonic figures. As she walked along the hallway, her eyes looked left to right, but she found herself being led down a certain path. Following her gut feeling, she followed where it led her as she gazed upon everything she saw with fascination of any child would have. Finally, she soon found herself in front of a giant oak door, and that pull she felt was only stronger as she inched closer to the door. However, she could also feel that same sense of familiarity from last night inkling its way into her once again, causing her to hesitate. Was the man from last night on the other side of this door? She didn't know, but she could not ignore the pull any longer, and slowly she gave a shy knock on the door. She didn't get a response for a few seconds before a voice muffled by the door answered her. "Come in, child." Beckoned by some unknown force, she obeyed, albeit shyly. Opening the door, Akasha saw the room to actually look like her father's study, but much bigger in comparison. Two giant windows to her right that gifted you to the side of the outside with long crimson drapes, shadowing most of the sun's light. The long red carpet rolled out from the doorway to the desk at the center of the chamber. At the far end of the chamber, she saw a long bookcase filled with books that stretched to both ends of the chamber. Running along the left side of the wall, she saw 5 suits of knight armor running from the doorway to the other end of the chamber. Overall, Akasha was amazed at the sheer size of the chamber before her, but her attention was instantly on the one thing that caught her gaze when she moved her eyes to the oak wooden desk. It was a man for sure, but he was very tall, probably around 6'4". The man was dressed in clothing that looked a bit strange to her. Brown leather boots that went up to his knees with plated armor embedded into the boots. Black pants with the ends tucked inside the boots, while up he wore a large red sash with a skeleton skull as a clasp. On up he wore a black long-sleeved shirt, which over this was a chainmail chest guard that was red as blood with golden outlinings. His shoulders had shoulder guards, and from his back it looked as if he had a long crimson cape. Lastly, she saw a pair of red dual gauntlets that ended up at his wrists. Then she looked up at the man's face, pale skin, not pale as death, but a healthy shade of pale. Long golden spiky hair fell down that man's neckline in a tamed fashion, covering his ears mostly. 2 long bangs fell to the sides of his angular sharp face, while the rest fell past his neck. The golden hair seemed as bright as the sun itself, a stark contrast to his pale skin. His face also showed signs of a stubble. Then she saw his eyes. Those eyes were unforgettable. They were no longer that menacing glowing crimson from last night, but they held that same distinctive threshold of absolute power and authority. His eyes were now a shade of liquid azure, as his slitter eyes looked deep into her emerald orbs. There was no mistaking it, this was the same man as before. Those eyes were the same as the ones last night, but what had caused him to change from that dried up old corpse into this man she saw now? "Child, please have a seat, we have much to discuss." His voice shook her from her stupor, and shyly she found a chair in front of the desk and sat down. She saw his impassive expression and gave a nod before he took his seat, and for the next few seconds the man just stared at Akasha, causing the young to shift nervously in her chair before he finally broke the silence. "Your name, child?" he asked, but the authority in his voice made her know to obey this man, as his presence demanded respect from everyone. Not even her father or Lord Shinso gave off such a presence before. "A Akasha Bloodriver, sir," she answered timidly, causing the man to give another nod as drummed his fingers against his desk. "Good, now it would seem you have suffered a betrayal, child, and by your parents no less," he said, causing her eyes to widen at not only remembering the betrayal, but at how this man knew. Then she saw his eyes just staring back into hers. "How did yo?" "Eyes are like portals to one's soul, young one, plus the men from last night gave me very interesting information concerning you and your parents." He didn't tell her how, and honestly she didn't want to know how he learned it from the men he had literally eaten alive. But now Akasha found herself stuck in a predicament. Her parents betrayed her, and she really didn't want to go back, only to have her life threatened. "But the most interesting thing is your blood, child," he said, causing the young girl to look up at him with surprise evident in her jade orbs. "My blood?" She received a nod from the nameless man who intertwined his fingers together and stared directly at her. "That is correct, your blood is very special, not because of this Lord Shinso, but because of something else that I theorize is because time has long since forgotten of the bloodline. So I'll tell you now, it is because of your blood that I am awake again, and for that you have my thanks." He aided, giving her a nod, causing to blush shyly as she looked down. Then his other's words caused confusion to swell up in her head. His words sounded so vague as if something very important was forgotten. Seeing her confusion, the man spoke once more. "Let me first introduce myself. My name is Dracul Naruto, and this blood of Shinso does not originate from him, but from me. I won't go into detail, but I will say this, young one. You have my blood running through your veins, and because of your situation I've decided on something, unless you of course agree to it," he said as he stared at the young pink-haired vampire with an impassive expression. For Akasha, this sudden bout of information was too much for one to bear, because in this time and age, Lord Shinso was said to be the strongest vampire to ever live, and to receive his blood was a blessing among vampires. But right now she just heard that she was in the presence of the true bearer of that bloodline, which was running through her veins. It was a lot to take in. Though in all honesty she didn't know this man at all besides his name, but she felt more at peace with him now than had ever been with anyone else before. "What's the question?" she asked, causing the man to look at her before closing his eyes. You have my blood running through your veins, and it has been a very long time since I've been asleep. I will not allow one who holds the strongest amount of my blood without proper control and training to wander this world. In addition, seeing as your parents have betrayed you, I offer you this." Opening his eyes, he let his eyes bleed red, causing Akasha to stiffen. "I will bring you under my wing and train you to utilize that power, but to do so I will have to release you of the impurities of your parents, along with any other impurities in your blood, and turn you into a full-blooded Dracul. I will train you, and in return you will live under this roof and serve me in my name. You will forever be bound to me for eternity, and no manner of sorcery in Machi or heaven can break this bond. What is your answer, child?" he asked the young girl who took his question before looking down in thought. For the young vampiress, she didn't know what to say. To be offered this would be a dream come true for her. Her parents had never truly treated her like a daughter, but as a trophy, and never truly trained her physically, but mentally prep her for a life as mistress to some noble later on. True, she didn't know this man, but already just by having this small conversation and the time she had now made her feel more safe and secure than she ever has. But to turn away her life as a blood river, had she had any good or fond memories with a life as the heir? Now that she thought about, the young girl couldn't remember a day in her life that she was able to act for herself as she was told what to do, but never given the choice for herself to make. Now however, Akasha had that freedom and independence to do what she could with her life. And right now her instincts were telling her agree to trust this man, and she had to agree. Besides, maybe she would learn more about him later on with her time under his wing. Bowing her head, Akasha gave a big smile. "I accept, my lord," she said, causing Naruto to nod before he stood up from his chair. "Then stand, Akasha Bloodriver, and prepare yourself," he said, causing her to nod. Standing up, she watched as he kneeled down in front of her. "Come and embrace your new life, Akasha, my student," he said, and without an ounce of hesitation Akasha walked toward and let herself be embraced. Then she felt immense pain erupt from her neck. Unable to scream, she held on tightly as her master drained away the impurities of her old parents, and just as he injected his own blood into her veins, the pain became excruciating. That mind shut down and her vision went black. Naruto felt the young as the ritual neared its end go unconscious in his arms, which was no surprise as this was extremely painful, but he was surprised with the young girl, as this ritual would have killed any other vampire of older age, but she held on neared its end at that. To even survive this, and from his very own fangs told him that this girl truly was something else. A small smile tugged at his lips as he picked up his new protege. The young girl truly had a strong will to live. As he looked down at the sleepy pink head, he felt his blood coursing through her veins, unlocking her vampiric side, and already he saw the changes coming in. However, he let his eyes glance toward the outside as his mind went to something else. Knowing the girl needed her sleep, he raised his free-handed and snapped his fingers. The door to his study opened to reveal a man dressed in formal butler attire with deathly pale skin, sharp blue eyes that showed complete and total loyalty to him. Wavy blonde hair fell past his neckline to his mid-back with streaks of red, but his stature showed professionalism to his master. With one arm at his waist, the man took a small bow. "You need me, my lord?" The man spoke whilst Naruto nodded to the man before casting his gaze down to his sleeping protege. "Yes, Frankenstein, take young Akasha back to her chambers. She needs her rest after surviving the ritual. Her body and mental state is extremely taxed," he said, causing the man called Frankenstein to raise both eyebrows in surprise before he cast his gaze to the sleeping Pincat with a look of astonishment. "Ah, I see," the young princess agreed. "Then I shall take her to bed then, my lord," he said, causing Naruto to nod before he handed the sleeping girl to the other blonde. Then as Frankenstein left to the door, Naruto turned his gaze out to the window as his mind wandered off the events that led up to now. His awakening had been, for the lack of the better word, surprising, as he had thought he would never wake up again, but now after so long, so very long, he'd finally been awakened. The seal that kept him in stasis had been destroyed by the blood of his own descendant. He looked down at his hands as he remembered the last night. He devoured Akasha's assassins and let their memories absorb into his mind. What they saw and experienced went through his brain for just a second, but it was enough for Naruto to realize that it hadn't been a century or two since he went to sleep. It had been more than a millennia. His era was gone, that much was for certain, but Machi was still the same. The rule of power was still kept in balance. However, the memories of his latest victims caused him to scowl ever so slightly at the ways of how vampires of this day and age had become. Broken into separate houses and feuding over the simplest of things. Over who had more influence of their land and who had more power to rule them all. Even a council had been formed of elder vampires. The thought caused Naruto's face to form into a small snarl, revealing his fangs. This was not by any means the race he had brought into existence. The race he brought into the world was honor-bound and protected their own. He raised them, trained them, and fought with them during the war in ancient times, but now seeing his sons and daughters' blood dwindle down and their descendants acting like bickering little children caused him to feel a sense of anger. But the only salvation he found in all this was the one held the strongest amount of his blood. Akasha, the young child, had been a surprise. When he first awoke he'd been in a state of primal hunger as he hadn't eaten in centuries, but when he smelt the blood in Akasha he had stopped himself. Her blood. His blood in her was strong, but not nearly as strong as it was in his children in the days of old. He couldn't kill her last night, but now after thinking about it as he sorted through the assassin's memories, he came to realize that the young girl was literally the last living descendant who carried the strongest amount of his blood. He wasn't about to leave her out in the world at the hands of these wretches that called themselves vampires. As for this Lord Shinso, he would find him, and pending on the meeting, he would either enslave the vampire or kill him outright for using the blood he held as a means to gain fame. However, I shouldn't act rashly about this. It has been over a millennia since my time, and no doubt records of my day have been lost to the ages. The ancient times are nothing more than a myth to the modern day demon. So in all things I am a no-name figure in Machi here. He rubbed his chin and thought. In his time he held prestige and power over trillions of vampires and commanded an army that could equal the armies of heaven itself. He was the single most influential being in Machi, but now his time was over and no one in this era knew anything about him, and while that had caused him to be a little irritated, it also represented him with an idea. He had a clean slate, no one knew him, and he could feel his powers returning, albeit slower than he would like. He could start over and rebuild what he once had, and this time he would not allow it to fall to the hands of his most hated enemies. His eyes glowed a sinister crimson as his memories came rushing back before his ceiling, how all his most enemies banded together to take him out. Their battle had been waged for a total of 5 days with no victor until they used a forbidden spell that cancelled his power temporarily to seal him away. He cast his gaze at his desk where he picked up a parchment of the same sigil that had been on his coffin before it burned away from the contact of Akasha's blood. His eyes roamed the seal for a few seconds as he looked upon each name of the outer rim of the sigil. You thought you bested me, you fools, but now that I'm back you will regret the day you crossed me. Shaking his thoughts away, he put the parchment down before he walked towards the window, casting his gaze out to see the realm of mankind at its finest. The blue sky, the open ocean, the forests and mountains. A city in the far distance made Naruto realize that mankind had also evolved since his time. Just a little, as they were still in his eyes parasites that deserved nothing more than death. Nonetheless, he let his thoughts wander back to his castle when he had finished eating. He had looked upon his castle now in ruins and had used what power that had returned to reform the castle back to the way it was in his time. No doubt with it being restored humans would see it due to the medieval side it promoted, but thanks to a simple illusion, he was able to steer away the annoying curious mortals from his castle. He'd rather not have their filth near his home. Then came finding his most trusted slave, a man called Frankenstein. The fellow blonde had been with him for the longest amount of time, and Naruto had personally trained him to master his unique powers. The man was loyal to him and him only, and proven his loyalty countless times, and lived only to serve him till his death. He went down into the underground dungeons of his castle and awoke his servant from his comatose state. After which Naruto spent most of his time throughout the night sorting through his memories and the memories of the assassins as he left the information digest, but he'd also spent a good amount of time gazing down at the sleeping Akasha before coming to the decision he had made a few minutes ago. The girl's potential was being wasted and he was not about to let her not fully realize her great potential as his descendant. He would not let her become like these filth that called themselves vampires. It was just not gonna happen. Though Naruto was sure of one thing, he would be getting visitors sometime soon. If his awakening was anything to go by, then truly the most powerful of the demons of this era would be flocking to his location sometime soon. Among them no doubt Naruto would meet the former parents of Akasha, which he knew the meeting wouldn't be good for them, and pending on how it goes, if they even survive. Perhaps this Lord Shinso would make an appearance. All in time, he wagered. Well, might as well start Akasha's training when she wakes up, he uttered before he felt Frankenstein's presence behind his study's doors and spoke. Come in. Frankenstein came in, closing the door behind him, and wailed to his master and stopped at his side, turning his gaze as well to the windows. He spoke to his lord. The princess is in bed, my lord, and already showing signs of surviving the turning. He said before he heard his lord sigh before he felt his master's gaze upon him. Why do you insist on calling my protege princess, Frankenstein? He questioned, causing an amused smirk to form on the man's lips. She has your blood running thick in her veins, and for all intents and purposes she is not only your student but now your daughter in blood, my lord. So the way I see it, calling her princess seems fitting, but I will stop if you so wish, master. He said. He received only silence as his answer, and thus he stood at his master's side awaiting for his next order. He knew that the era, a change he would gladly help spread and usher in the influence of his almighty lord and show the realm of Machi and mankind who it is that they should fear. For the Nosferatu has returned and he was gonna shake the three realms with his return. Again. Akasha always wondered what it felt like to train in your vampire powers, to manipulate the yokai within you and hone it to be your own weapon in battle. In her old life she never had the chance to know the experience, as her former parents only put her through mental training of being a future good wife to some noble. It was something the pink-haired vampiress wanted to know about, to experience. Now she was starting to regret her haste. It was the second day of her new life with her new master and teacher, yet already she could feel a major difference in her than how she felt just last night. After waking up this morning she had felt a change in her body and discovered that she had gained a significant change. First off, she had grown a bit more and her skin looked as if it had paled a bit more than it was before. She also felt significantly more aware and full of energy than she ever had in her entire life, but the biggest change of all was that she felt her body was stronger than before. She had been visited shortly thereafter by her master's servant called Frankenstein, a nice guy she would say, and she'd been told their master wished to see her for the start of her training. That had gotten her fully awake and eager to get started. She got dressed and followed the blonde butler out from the castle and to the backyard, which seemed to be used for training purposes mostly. She followed Frankenstein until she saw her master in the middle of the training grounds in the same clothing as before. It was then he had turned to her and explained to her the changes she felt was the result of eliminating the blood of her former parents and infusing his blood into her veins, causing the change in her body. She didn't understand most of it due to her age, but she knew that she was no longer the same girl she was 2 days ago. Nor was she no longer a bloodriver by blood. Her master had made that very clear before he started her training. Her connections to her parents were gone and she no longer had a connection to that family any longer. Then he started her training. That's where things led to now, as the 5-year-old Akasha was sparring against her master, who said the best way for her to unlock her use of her yokai was to exert herself beyond her limits. Thus she was pit against a very man who gifted her with his own blood. And she was learning real quick that her master was not merciful in his teachings, as every time she tried to attack him he merely blocked and countered fluidly, yet enough to throw her back to the ground. Yet she also learned he wasn't like her other teachers from her old life, who only taught her to get in good with her family. He was genuinely interested in her training and put forth the effort to make her better, stronger, and faster. And already, even as the dirt, grime, and soreness of her entire body weighed down on her, the young girl was feeling a sense of accomplishment every time she found herself improving the smallest bit. She could feel some kind of energy within her begging to be unleashed, and every time she attacked she felt so close to grasping it, but not yet enough to fully grasp it. Nonetheless, the girl knew, and her master knew, she was close to reaching it. Even then she felt herself growing more accustomed to battle, as her mind was already watching, studying, and thinking up new attacks, strategies and counters against her master. What she didn't know was that Naruto was also thinking along the same lines, but a bit different to how she was already progressing with her first time in actually combat sparring. As he caught her leg he brought up his forearm, blocking her punch, before slapping the back end of his hand into her abdomen, with just the right amount of force that knocked the air of her lungs, before knocking her backwards. Though she was nowhere close to an actual combatant, her progress was astounding. She has an innate ability to think fast and create strategies on the fly, and due to the transfusion of my blood and the total removal of her old parents, her body had been greatly enhanced. Her speed, strength, reflexes and even her senses have been enhanced. And due to unlocking her vampire self, it's only made her fighter instinct come through. Still. He watched with impassive eyes as Akasha stood up again, ignoring the injuries on her body. He could clearly see she was reaching her limit, but the look in her eyes caused him to mentally nod with approval. She had the look of someone who was willing to do whatever it took to get strong. Along with her incredible willpower, he could see her stubbornness and her extreme determination glaze over her emerald orbs. Perhaps his blood had done more than he had thought. Glancing to the side, he grunted when he saw the amused smile from Frankenstein. The man must have saw it too. Though when he turned his gaze back to Akasha, his eyebrows perked when he saw her coming back at him, but he saw it for just a second. Her eyes bled crimson and her eyes morphed into slits. But the most promising thing was the flickering of red bolts of lighting covering her left leg, as it was mildly shrouded in a red malicious aura. His lips formed into a small smirk as Frankenstein on the sidelines looked at the scene with wide eyes. She just unconsciously called forth her yokai and infused it into her leg, multiplying the power in her kick. Impressive, child, but now you must learn to willfully use your yokai. The blonde vampire lord hummed in approval before he raised his hand just as Akasha's leg connected with his palm. Boom. If you had seen the aftermath, normal demons would have been left in complete shock, and vampires of this day and age would have turned green with envy at what they saw. Naruto had Akasha's exhausted and used up unconscious form over his shoulder, but the result of her kick had done incredible damage. For behind Naruto the entire ground had been upheaved from the ground, the surrounding trees were completely obliterated from the shockwave of her Yokai-infused kick. A deep trench ran through the forest ending just a few yards away, but the destructive power that came from the young girl was something to behold. If it had been any other vampire child they wouldn't have been able to even unleash a morsel of that kind of destruction. Yet when Naruto looked down at the sleeping child over his shoulder, he could see that Akasha truly, even before gaining his direct blood, had incredible potential to be the greatest vampire of her era, but now there would be no doubt that she would one of the most powerful vampires of this era and in history. Of that Frankenstein had doubt and was sure his master would morph the young girl into what she was meant to be. Then they both heard the young girl snore, causing Frankenstein to smirk in amusement at how his master eyed the young girl snoring on his shoulder without a care in the world. Then his master looked at him with a pointed gaze that clearly sent him a message. "Say a word and you will die." And Frankenstein knew his master would follow through with the threat, besides he would never disobey his master. Deciding it was best to head inside Frankenstein, and his master walked back to the castle with Akasha snoring away on the blonde vampire's shoulder. Then Naruto stopped before he looked to his left, his eyes narrowed slightly when he sensed a small surge of yokai to the far east. Then he turned his head back and continued his stride. It seemed he would be getting visitors sooner than expected. 3 days later, outskirts of Dracul Castle. The Vampire Council was a well-known group of vampires that had dedicated their lives to lead their race into a prosperous and better future for their people. The foundation of the council's founding had been made with a good cause, but over the centuries after its creation, the members of the council had fought and bickered over matters that concerned them personally and no longer for the benefit of their race as a whole. The council was made up of a total of 3 elder vampires who were once lords of their own noble houses before retiring it to their heirs and became councillors. Each member represented a major vampire noble house that had become very influential over the vampire species. So the power of each member alone was not to ever be underestimated, but the council's power as a whole was to both be respected and feared not just throughout the vampire race, but all of hell. The members consisted of Karachi Kazaki, who had ushered in ways to gather food resources without the need for mass harvesting of human bodies. Teeps Vladimir the Vi, who had been the one to stop a rebellion of 5 minor vampire families that would have caused major weakness in the vampire threshold. Shuzin Drago, a man who used his major influence to gain the alliance of many other vampire families from across the globe to serve the council. Overall, the council's combined might and influence was nearly unmatched, with the circle of the kitsun shamans in second. So let it be known that in this time and age, nothing ever dodges the eyes of the Vampire Council, especially things that cause great distress or chaos among their own race. So when the council had been alerted by the huge surge of malicious power erupted in the same location as the heiress of the prestigious Bloodriver had gone missing the same night she went missing, they had quickly called for a meeting on the course of action they should take. Many ideas had been thrown around the chamber on how to deal with the situation or the unknown entity that had released that surge of power to have affected the very sky and caused the moon to turn blood red. Many had called for a total offensive of wiping the threat out, but the more logical councillors negated the idea and proposed a more simple and yet clever way to fix the problem. Go directly to the source as a means to extend a hand of friendship to their newly awakened brethren if the power they felt was truly that of a vampire, but to also gain information and if possible find the missing heiress. However, their plan had come with 2 great surprises even before they left to the location. First off, the parents of the heiress had been extremely adamant in coming to find the young girl, and the 3 councillors had been hesitant because their rash behavior may affect their attempt to bring an alliance with the newly awakened mystery vampire. However, seeing as the Bloodriver family was a growing influential house in the vampire world, they were inclined to not disagree. However, at the last surprise that truly shocked them all, and the surprise came in the form of Lord Shinso. I must say it is a rather big surprise to see you wishing to come with us to meet this new brother. I never knew you to be one to socialize yourself with those not of your bloodline. Drago spoke to the most powerful vampire in their era. Drago looked like a middle-aged man with straight loose black hair, with strands of grey in between, that was swept back with old and perceptive black eyes. He was fair-skinned with a black-grey stubble, he was about 5'8" with a strong wiry physique that betrayed his age. His eyes glanced toward Lord Shinso, who strode alongside him. The vampire in question in appearance looked extremely different from his brethren as he stood about 6'0" with a strong muscular physique that was hidden by his noble garment clothing. He was pale and his face was both sharp and slightly feminine, but his eyes were a shade of ebony that seemed to suck in the souls of those that stared too long. His long silver hair was pulled in the back in a ponytail that trailed his mid-back with 2 silver bangs, framing the sides of his noble face. He was dressed in noble attire of European tailor craftsmanship. His face remained completely impassive to the elder's unasked accusation, but answered him either way. My presence here is only because of my successor and blood has gone missing, and it is within my responsibility to find her. Nothing more than that, elder. He said, causing Drago to hum in thought, though it was clear that Drago did not completely believe Shinso's words to be the total truth. After all, they were going to find a vampire whose awakening had caused the entire sky to turn jet black from all across the globe, from what was reported by their spies in human society, and the moon had turned blood red. That had always been a sign of a bad omen in legend, so Drago knew for certain that Shinso was at least curious. I just want to know if our little girl is okay, spoke a woman with long pink hair with jade eyes. She stood at 5'5" with a fair complexion. The woman's face expressed worry for their missing daughter. The woman wore a long red dress with a ruby necklace around her neck and a few rings on her hands. This woman was Bloodriver Harem, wife of the lord of the Bloodriver house and mother of Akasha Bloodriver. Her husband tensed slightly, but no further reaction came from the man besides his face morphing into a stern expression. The man was at least a few inches taller than his wife. His shaggy brown hair fell past his eyes and ears, his brownish-red eyes stared forward with empathy, but the gears in his head were clearly going over the development to what happened to their child. He wore extravagant-looking garments that seemed to be of Western culture, which hid his physique from the eyes of everyone. This man was Bloodriver Mizuki, lord of the Bloodriver house and father to Akasha Bloodriver. Still hard to believe that this vampire has awakened, cause I was led to believe no more sleepers had existed or they died out. The second counselor Vladimir said while humming in thought. Sleepers were originally called that, but the term meant for vampires that had long ago existed before their time and had went into a deep sleep that borderlined eternal, which pretty much meant death for all vampires. Sleeps in this era had either long since died of starvation from their century or two of sleep or had been lost to the sands of time and out of the reach of their brethren. So to have one to awaken in the human world and their power to cause such a supernatural phenomenon, that was simply shocking and was made a priority to find the vampire at all cost. Vladimir just gave a small sigh. The counselor stood at the same height as Drago, but his midnight black gray hair fell down his back while two long bangs fell over his shoulders. His black eyes closed in thought of this new development. His clothing more or less the same as his fellow counselors, only it was black and red intermixed. The final counselor, Kazaki, just remained silent as his eyes stared overhead past the forestry and directly at the looming castle that seemed to be ignored by the eyes of human society. His mind was already thinking at possible theories at how the humans just seemed to ignore the giant castle that loomed at the far outskirts of the small city. Had the vampire cast an illusion to shield his castle from prying eyes of mankind? Or was this some effect the vampire's own presence had that caused the humans' primal instincts to simply ignore a building that housed a creature that hunted them down like prey? Nevertheless, Kazaki was determined to find out who exactly this vampire was. Finding the heiress was merely secondary to him. Kazaki was the old man of the group, as he had a full head of gray hair that fell to his shoulders with a gray goatee to match his brown wise orbs which pierced the veil beyond the forests to see the castle far in the distance. Though his body was old, he still had the greatest wisdom of the three counselors and his power was still respected even in his old age. He wore a simple black shihakusho with black hakama pants. Around his waist was a green sash, while over his shoulders was a black haori, while on his feet he wore waraji straw shoes. Truly he fit the part of an old Japanese man that clearly hidden the very powerful former vampire lord under this simple facade. As the group walked deeper into the forests, though, they all felt a growing force of oppression come down on them, a feeling at first they had shook off, but it had only grew strong and stronger as they traveled closer to their location. The darkness of the forest seemed to encroach upon them, and with the forest blocking out the sky made the situation all the more strange. In fact, if Drago's mind wasn't playing tricks on him, he could have sworn he just saw his own shadow move. This was getting creepy even for him. Hader felt a cold chill crawl up her spine as she grabbed her husband tightly. Normally she was never frightened easy as she was a very prideful woman, but this forest. This was not a normal forest. Shinso, unlike the other, knew something was off. Why was he? Narrowed his eyes as he looked from left to right, catching the slightest fluctuations of the darkness moving about in the shadows. He'd already come to the conclusion that there wasn't any demons around them nor any sentient life form. However, he did feel something, and what he felt was unnatural to what he has grown accustomed to. His eyes widened briefly when he caught the sight of a giant orb floating deep in the forests, but what was really surprising was that it had opened his eye to reveal a giant red slit eyeball staring back at him as if he were nothing more than an insect, a lowly little worm that held no power in comparison. That feeling was so intense that it froze Shinso right where he stood, gaining the attention of the others. "Lord Shinso, are you okay?" Kazaki said, placing his hand on the vampire's shoulders, causing him to flinch before he regained control of himself to mask his outward appearance. It is nothing however in his mind that was an entirely different story, for there was clearly something here, and for the first time in his life, it had caused Shinso to actually freeze on the spot. Shinso was beginning to realize that coming here may have been a mistake. Soon enough to the group's well-hidden satisfaction they had finally gotten to the end of the forests, and in doing so when they got to the end they were welcomed to quite a sight. What welcomed them was not the fresh green grass. Instead the ground was just dead, the grass had withered and died and the ground below had turned black. The trees surrounding the castle were completely withered away and dead as well, completely opposite to the forest they had just left. Then their eyes caught the huge structure before them and Vladimir could only let out a long whistle of approval. Whoever this vampire is, he sure had good tastes. This design is clearly from the medieval ages, he said while mentally praising the vampire's tastes. His fellow counselors though rolled their eyes. They soon came to the door, which was a two-piece giant wooden door. Looking up at it, Kazaki found what looked to be doorknobs shaped to be demon maws and merely raised an eyebrow. When he went to grasp it however, his eyes widened when he saw the demon's maw move. Then fangs sprouted from the maw and it quickly snapped shut, but he reacted just in time to pull his hand away. Clearly however he saw the demon's eyes glow a faint red as it grinned, revealing its razor-sharp fangs in a sinister grin. "Elder?" Shaken from his stupor, Kazaki looked at Drago, as both him, Vladimir and even Shinso eyed him with confusion. Then he turned his head back to the doorknob only to see it hadn't changed in the slightest. What the devil was that? Shaking his head at his fellow's strange behavior, Drago took the initiative and grasped the doorknob, missing Kazaki's slight flinch before knocking on the door. Then they waited and the counselors could tell the blood drivers were getting the most anxious or impatient in the woman's case, but soon they all heard doors open. But they saw someone on the other end and the person caused a few eyebrows to be raised when they saw a blonde-haired man with sharp blue eyes look upon them with a smile. "Hello honorable guests, may I inquire as to why a group of vampires are here?" he asked in a polite fashion, and though they were surprised that he could read them so easily, Vladimir saw no reason to deny the man the answer to his question. "We're here to meet the lord of this castle, a vampire that awakened just a few days ago. Are you him by chance?" he asked, causing the blonde-haired man to blink in surprise before he gave an amused chuckle. They watched as the man took a step back as he swept his right arm across his waist. "Oh no, I am not, but you must be talking about my master. Please come on in, I'm sure he would like to speak to you as well," he said with a bow, where the elder gave a nod before he and the rest of the group followed the blonde-haired man down the hall. They were able to see the decor and they were amazed at such variety of decorations in just this hall alone. But for Shinso, he had his eyes solely on the back of their guide with a stern gaze. Something felt extremely off about this man. He couldn't put his finger on it, but his man did not give an aura of any demon he had come across in his life, but he did feel a rather malicious aura from the man, though it was very well hidden. "I better keep my eye on him." They followed Frankenstein through the hall and soon they came to two giant doors at the end of the hall, and it was there the blonde-haired butler raised his hand, knocked on the door. "Master, guests have come to speak with you," he said. The seconds passed by before they all perked up when they heard a response. "Let them in." Nodding, Frankenstein pushed the doors open, causing a great rumbling sound to fill the chamber, but as the group walked into the chamber, they all felt one thing when they took that first step inside the chamber. A malicious, sinister, oppressive aura coming down on them, weighing them all down. But they were still able to keep their posture with some struggle, but they all wondered where that pressure was coming from. They soon found out. They all found their gaze drawn forth like a moth to a flame as the far end of the chamber, and up a few steps was a black throne, and sitting in that throne was a man. The blonde, spiky-haired, azure-slitted-eyed man wearing a strange apparel of armor they had never seen before. The man sat in the chair with a stoic expression on his face. His right arm rested against the armrest, while his left arm was up with his hand propping his chin as his disinterested eyes gazed down at them. His azure eyes stared at them all for just a second before he spoke. "Now, who are you, and why have you come to my castle?" His blunt and rude inquiry was not lost on them. Then again the elders theorized the vampire did not know of who he was speaking to and was rightfully in right to question a bunch of stranger coming to his home uninvited. Shinso stared at the man with narrowed eyes when he looked at the other blonde that greeted them at the door. He at least could feel something from him, but this man was different. He wasn't doing anything, and yet the sheer pressure weighing down on not just the others, but even himself, caused alarm bells to ring in his head. Was this man's sheer presence causing such a pressure? Was he even trying? Kazaki stood up to answer Naruto. "My apologies on the behalf of my fellows, kinsmen. Let us introduce ourselves. I am Karachi Kazaki, and these two others beside me are Teeps Vladimir the Vi and Shuzan Drago. We are of this era's council of vampires. This man behind me is Lord Shinso, and behind him are the Bloodriver family." He received no response from the man who just kept his gaze solely on them. "And why is it you have come here?" Naruto questioned. To offer a hand of friendship to you brother and offer you extension of our hand to have an alliance with us. We can also offer you a. What year is it? Naruto questioned, causing Kazaki to pause in his rehearsed speech he gave to other vampire lords to join the council. It caught him off guard at how the blonde vampire seemed to just ignore his words and instead of asking such a simple question. It is 1634 AD, Kinsman Drago answered. Naruto just hummed in thought before he cast his gaze back at Kazaki. I see, though his face expressed no emotion, his mind was already thinking on how long he'd been asleep. It truly has been more than a millennia. Ahem, kinsman, as I was saying, we the council can offer you a place among our brothers and sisters. If you are so inclined to agree, you will benefit from agreeing with resources and servants. Kazaki said before he saw Naruto merely stared at him for just a lingering second. I have no need for resources as I have my own ways of gathering supplies, and as for servants, I have no need for subjects that are not my own. So is there anything that you could possibly offer me to even consider joining you? He said in a monotone fashion. His words struck then three elders to make them rethink of what they do offer him. Normally vampires usually accepted the offer at first chance cause resources in human blood was difficult to come by without potentially exposing yourself. Others that didn't accept they just ignored from then on, but since this vampire's awakening caused a great deal of panic across the globe and the surge of power that erupted from his location made him a potentially powerful vampire. And they would be fools to not get him on their side. Thinking it over, Vladimir's eyes lit up before speaking. How about in addition to joining us as an allied house to the council, you get to attain the right as an independent house. Also, as a sign of good faith, we can offer you a substantial amount of information to anything that is within our power in return to your agreement and service. Those the offer caused the other two counselors to glance his way with apprehension. It did make a compelling offer. Looking at Vladimir, Naruto mused over the offer for a minute or so before he looked toward Vladimir with a stoic expression. I will agree to your terms on one condition, and that condition is this. If anyone so much as comes at me, anyone associated with me or my castle within or outside with ill intent, I will act with the appropriate action needed, be it another demon or one of our own. He said, causing the council to blink at the rather small condition. They didn't see the trouble of the offer, and accepting it would gain them an ally, a powerful one at that. Nodding to one another, Kazaki spoke, we the council agree to your condition and to explain what it is you do in return to being an ally to the council. If we are ever in need of assistance, we can trust to call upon you and trust you to answer our call. Now may we know the name of our new ally? Staring them down, the blonde vampire lord spoke, my name is Naruto, Dracul Naruto. Satisfied with their answer, the council nodded, that is, until Naruto felt a burning gaze upon him and he turned his stoic gaze on the bloodrivers. When he saw Haru giving him an ugly stare, he raised an eyebrow. May I help you, Ms.? He left his statement linger, causing Haru to glare even harder, and when the council saw this, they grew a bit stony at the woman as her behavior to their newest ally was threatening the very alliance they just built. My name is Haru Bloodriver, and this is my husband Mizuki Bloodriver. We also have come because we have certain information that our child and heiress to our family was last seen here. However, she disappeared right when your awakening erupted, and so I ask you. Have you seen a 5-year-old child that has my hair and eyes? Her name was Akasha. She said, causing Naruto to give a small frown. Mizuki gave a small scowl to the man as well. They had planned to have her kidnapped after disappearing on her during a stroll in the woods and have the people they hired take her to a noble that would have gifted them in return some level of nobility and then say to Lord Shinso, who would have come by to take her, that she'd been kidnapped and held for ransom by that very same noble who would have been accused of kidnapping the child of the Bloodrivers and successor to Lord Shinso himself, and whatever he would say would have been ignored or told as lies to save his own hide. But they had miscalculated on the man before him, whose awakening caused their plan to go awry. Now they had a missing child that was their only ticket to a life of nobility and prestige. Soon Naruto's eyes lit up for the briefest moment before he leaned forward as a small glaze of recognition came into his eyes. Ah yes, you must mean the girl that had stumbled into my tomb prior to my awakening. However, I am sorry to say that girl no longer exists. He said, causing the occupants besides himself and Frankenstein's eyes to widen at his words. Though they all missed the amused glaze in the blonde servant's eyes before they disappeared. Shinso frowned visibly at the news. The man's words sounded so vague, but it caused a great deal of alert within him. What had happened to his successor? No longer exists. What do you mean by that? Explain. Haru shouted as she took a step forward as her yokai pulsed slightly. Then suddenly Haru felt something against her neck and her eyes slowly looked down to see the glint of silver blade at her throat. Take another step towards master and I will end your pathetic life where you stand, worm. Frankenstein's voice cut through the chamber. The coldness of his tone and his sharp eyes narrowing down at Haru caused the woman to freeze up. For just a moment, the smallest of moments, she saw an untamed amount of bloodlust in those blue orbs. As for the others, they hadn't even seen him move until he had spoke, and that caused a great deal of surprise and apprehension. This was no mere servant if his speed could go undetected by even their standards, and even Shinso had cast a appraising eye on the blonde-haired man. "Frankenstein, that is enough," Naruto said, and just at the threatening aura that is radiating off the servant, it just as quickly as dispersed when he heard his master's words. He disappeared before appearing at his master's side just as quick. Satisfied with this, Naruto turned his attention back on the woman and the other occupants. "As I was saying before I was interrupted, the child unfortunately was in close proximity of my coffin, and the resulting backlash of my awakening caused my surge of power to release upon her. It was too great and she was vaporized in result, so you have my condolences," he said. The blood drivers couldn't believe what they just heard. Akasha was dead. Their one chance to nobility and fame gone. All their planning and years of work in training the child to be a perfect wife to a noble and bring fame upon their house was all ruined. Soon the yokai started to build up within their body, but before either of the two could unleash it upon this man who had ruined their chances. Lord Shinso stepped in front of them with his eyes staring blankly into the equally stoic eyes of the vampire in front of him. In truth, he felt some resentment towards the man for killing his successor, but he also couldn't fault him due to it being an accident. However, when his eyes stared deep into the azure ones of the vampire before him, Shinso suddenly felt a prickling sensation inside his head before it went away. "I see, we will trouble no longer, Lord Dracul, we will be leaving right now, let's be off," he said, causing the others to nod, while the blood drivers hesitantly under the glare of Shinso followed him in step. Just as they left the door and their presence left his barrier, Frankenstein's face morphed into one of amusement. "My oh my, the vampires of this day and age are truly too gullible, my lord. It would seem your plan has succeeded," he said, causing Naruto to give a small nod before he released a sigh. "The council thinks that now that I have accepted that I will answer to their beck and call and obey them like a dog. Only they have brought upon the cause of their own destruction, and as for this Lord Shinso, I have left a special gift for him," he said, causing Frankenstein to smirk slightly. "And what of the blood drivers, my master?" Naruto just scoffed before he spoke. "It is not my place to deal with scum like them, is it not, Akasha?" Here he glanced to his right to see Akasha Dracul fade through a black smoky veil through the wall. Her face remaining stoic, nearly identical to her master's, but the scarlet glow in her ruby-red slitted yes showed the untold amount of anger within. "No, I will not let you dirty your hands with filth like that, my master, let me be the one to deal with them in the future," she said with a twinge of bloodlust in her voice. Frankenstein just smirked at the young 5-year-old vampiress. The training in just the last few days had done wonders for her, and with his master's blood running through her veins, had caused a significant change in her. She was still starting, but already she was very powerful and was already training in her abilities that she had discovered. But there was one thing that caught his attention. Naruto just gave a nod before he stood up from his seat before he raised his hand before placing it on top of Akasha's. Giving her a small pat on the head showed his approval of her, and the scene caused the blonde servant to smile. For he saw it, but hidden under the girl's pink bangs her cheeks flushed shyly at the touch of their master. Glancing shyly away, Akasha stood there as Naruto pat her head for the briefest moments. It was moments like that Akasha was growing to like, as it was the first time she had ever gained the approval of someone, but when she gained the approval of her master, it was different, as that was all that mattered to her now. He was the one who brought her on a new path of her own choice and her own free will, and it was because of that she was now attaining the power of a true vampire. She owed him everything and even more, and to serve him faithfully and completely was the only thing she could think of as of now. Perhaps another way would arise in time. 2-year time skip. It's been 2 years since Naruto was confronted by the council and his agreement to join them, and as the years flew by, some things have changed in the Dracul castle. Firstly, was the fact that after the council had left, his castle had been getting many visitors of late. Many of them had been other demons that had come in search of the one who released that monstrous power and chose to claim some form of fame by killing the one who released it. Now those very same demons were either killed or he had used them as practice dummies for Akasha to train on. Another thing was that Naruto had begun to use the opportunity to start back his army, and by doing that he had gone under his castle and opened the old gateway to where his old army of his era once resided. From there on, he had used the bodies of every demon that came to his castle and he killed off and brought it back as his undead minion. It would be a slow process, but he knew in time his army would be in full force once again. The third thing that had changed was in the form of his own student. After 2 years of living within the Dracul castle, her growth had only increased in both body and mind. Her demonic power had increased tremendously from the previous time when she had first been training. Her battle prowess from sparring with Frankenstein had gone up as her mind adjusted to more advanced techniques and counters that was starting to even cause the servant to put forth a little more effort. She hadn't sparred with her master since the first time, and she asked many times as to his reason why, and his reasons were always vague that caused her to pout. However, through it all the young vampiress had trained as hard as she could and beyond at first to become a true vampiress, but now over the years her desire was to gain the approval of her most precious person. And she had time and time again she never failed to gain his approval, and soon the pats on the head become her favorite things. The council had yet to contact Naruto though, and he had used that time well in planning his next move. Sitting down at his study, Naruto looked over the seal that Akasha had said was on his tomb before it burned away. Luckily he was able to conjure a replica from the residue of what was left to make a copy. Although it held no true power, the true significance was all in its design and appearance. His eyes scanned the sigil, and they narrowed when he came across the 11 names all around the outer rim of the seal. His other hand clenched the desk, causing his nails to sharp, thus carving into the wood. Nama, Lilith, Adramelech, Baal, Belphegor, Asmodeus, Asteroid, Rophicael, Beelzebub, Moloch, and Satan. You all thought you killed me, but now that I'm back I will make sure that you suffer for your actions against me. You 11 were right to fear me because now there won't be a shred of mercy for any of you now. Saying this, his eyes glowed crimson before the whites of his eyes bled ebony. And that's a promise. In all his days of serving his master, Frankenstein has never known his lord to have ever broke down into a fit of rage or anger. He had never shown a sign of reveling in the death and despair of those that had dared to stand in his way, nor did he ever show pity or remorse. It was just the fact that they had opposed him, thus they earned them death in return. It was as simple as that, for his master had always been above such acts of savagery, as he was a being who killed his enemies swiftly and with brutal efficiency. For he was the pinnacle of what it meant to be a vampire, the progenitor of all vampires, and with it came what was to be expected. He was noble and held a degree of honor and would never cause a mess with those he killed. If he were to kill you, you die, simple as that. If he was hungry and you were within his range, then there wouldn't be anything left of you, flesh, bones, blood and all wouldn't be anywhere. There was no mistake that vampires thrived in battle, something they had all inherited from his master, but that did not mean they sought battle, but only to show the vast difference in power to anyone that was foolish enough to stand up to them. Truly, Frankenstein found these aspects of his master to be admirable, but now after all that's happened he was seeing a vast change in his lord. After awakening up 2 years ago in an era that was not his own, and coming to find out what happened to his race since his sealing had caused a shift in his master. It had been very subtle at first, but after taking his strongest descendant and making her his student and daughter in blood. Dealing with this era's council of vampires and all these other changes had caused something in his master to awaken. It was a growing malevolence that he was sensing, though his master hid it well. Frankenstein had been in his service longer than anyone and knew his lord the best. His lord had gotten colder and more ruthless as the days passed by. He could sense his presence had become much more dark since the last 2 years have passed. Added with his powers slowly returning had made his presence all the more potent. He didn't know what was happening with his lord, but he was glad to see the one thing that had kept his master from going over the edge was remarkably his student. Akasha had been his main priority, to train her and bring out the potential within her, and he had done so as the girl's power had increased tremendously over the 2 years. But now Frankenstein's worry had grown as he looked upon the sight before him. He stood in front of the castle, but where once used to be the lush forest was now completely dead. The grass had withered and the trees had died out, becoming hollow husks of what they once were. Then laying all over the ground was the hundreds bodies of demons that had been frequently targeting the Dracul castle. Their shriveled up husks littered the ground, but in the center of this graveyard of bodies was his master, absorbing the last remnants of the blood of the other demons. However, he could see the aura that engulfed his lord, that shroud of darkness that morphed and shifted endlessly. He knew it was best to stay back from his master when he was like this, as it was during these times when his master was most annoyed. After all, it was best for one's health to steer clear from his master when annoyed, but when angry, well, there just wasn't any hope of survival. Looking down at the corpses, he saw skeletal hands emerging from a sea of darkness come up before wrapping around the husks, then they were pulled down beneath, where they were surely taken to the underground chambers for his master's growing army. Another of his master's inventions. Long ago his master had commanded a force of his own that shook all the 3 worlds, but its numbers were far too vast to keep spread out. So with his master's sorcery, he created a dimensional rift underneath the castle that collected his vast undead forces in a realm not linked to hell, heaven or the mortal world, but was linked to his master's castle or his master's beck and call. Simply genius. Frankenstein looked up at the sky and felt a knot of nervousness tighten in his stomach when he saw the sky slowly turning black. As far as the eye could see, the sky all over the earth was turning black. It was a good thing that Akasha was asleep in the castle after her training regime today, otherwise her mental state wouldn't be able to take the full front of their master's power like this. He could sense his master's power was affecting the world around them, but he dare not say a word and just stood on the sidelines as his master stood amongst the dead soil. For Naruto, he just stood there looking at the vast horizon before him as his mind went full speed. His eyes narrowed in annoyance. The cause of his annoyance was not because of the demons that had been coming to his castle in droves, in fact he welcomed it because it only strengthened his growing army. No, what was annoying the Lord of Vampires was the fact someone a vampire that was out there pulsing out their yokai directly toward him. It was a sign of a challenge to show who was the stronger demon. And at first Naruto ignored the challenge, but for the past few days this vampire's attempts only grew more desperate and was even using alternative ways to rile him. Damaging his castle, which didn't do anything due to how it was nearly impenetrable due to his presence, solidifying the minerals within, causing it to be indestructible by normal or demonic means. That had been only one of the many useless ways the vampire had tried to do so it could anger him. It didn't do much good, but that is until the vampire had targeted something that had really annoyed him. It targeted Akasha, and the young girl was still not at the level to face a vampire of this power, which was impressive to say the least, since the standards of a vampire's powers in this era was downright pitiful. Still, this vampire had dared to use his protege as a means to anger him. Well, he'd failed in that aspect, as he'd blocked that attempt himself and with a show of force repelled the yokai with just a morsel of his own. However, this vampire was stubborn and wouldn't give up. So Naruto just decided to end this, which is why he was releasing about 1/10 of his power in order to draw out this vampire. Due to the mastery over his own power, he fully capable to direct it solely on this vampire, so it wouldn't alert the petty counselor, that fraud Shinso. It wouldn't do to cause his plans to be ruined by a small slip of control of his power. However, it was time he dealt with this nuisance. Frankenstein, go back to castle, I've a bug to squash, he said, causing Frankenstein to raise an eyebrow before he nodded. Turning away, walked toward the castle, and as soon as Frankenstein entered the building, Naruto let loose a small frown. Are you done hiding, you wretched excuse of a vampire? He said before he soon heard the cackle filled with utter madness and insanity. His frown vanished and was replaced with a stoic expression as he soon heard the sound of screeching bats filling the air. Screech. Screech. Then he watched as a swarm of bats suddenly swirled in front of him until they all started to become one, creating a humanoid form. As the bats all started to morph into the form, it slowly stood up to a 6'6" height. As the bat started to be absorbed into the being, its appearance was finally revealed to show a man. However, this man did not look like your normal vampire, for the only thing he wore was a black suit of the 1400s Romanian armor, while at his back, he wore a long tattered blood-red cape. Strapped at his hip was what looked like a normal sword, but Naruto cared not for that, only to see the man's face. His skin was pale as death, that much was certain, but his skin was extremely twisted and morphed to resemble that of a human, but not entirely so, cause Naruto could see the way the man's flesh seemed to move on its own, as if it were alive. His long black locks fell past his shoulders, while streaks of silver gleamed. The man's blood-red eyes stared back into the impassive azure-slitted ones with slits of his very own, however they were filled with complete and utter madness. His mouth as set into a twisted grin that showed his sharp vampire fangs as his long claw-like hands twitched and ready for the inevitable fight. Hekaki, so a bug am I? You have no idea who I am, so let me introduce myself here. The vampire took a small bow. My name is Alucard, the oldest vampire, and you are going to be my next meal. He ended in a small shout of insane glee. But Naruto just narrowed his eyes on the fool in front of him, as his annoyance only grew as the talking bug dared to call itself the oldest vampire. Foolish. Though he could sense his blood within this man, it was mutated and eroded over the ages and by the stench of countless other demons, and this being caused Naruto to realize this man had been eating countless other demons in an effort to increase his own power, which caused the mutation. Still, in Naruto's eyes, he was only a bug. So why don't I hear the name of my latest meal? Alucard said with a grin. Then Naruto's eyes just flashed scarlet before he slowly raised his hand. A mere bug does not have the privilege to know my name. The only thing you need to know is this: know your place. And just as his hand came up, Alucard just cackled before he disappeared before appearing in front of Naruto in speeds most demons couldn't keep up with, and rearing back his left claw, he threw it forward. Then Naruto just uttered one word as his palm was in front of Alucard, while his azure eyes flashed scarlet. Kneel. Alucard's eyes widened when suddenly he felt an immeasurable amount come down upon him, and before he knew it, his body betrayed him as his knees instantly fell to the ground. His eyes further widened when he saw his clawed hand was gone. I would have thought the oldest vampire would be durable, perhaps I was wrong. Then the pain settled in. Ah. The vampire screamed as blood gushed out of the stump of where his hand used to be. The cut was clean and precise, as if it had been cut clean off by a sharp sword. However, Naruto just crushed the hand in his palm, absorbing it into his hand bones, and all as the blood seeped into his body, purging the impurities and adding to his own power. He just looked back at Alucard and spoke. "Oh please, quit your sniveling, you wanted to fight me, and so shall you get your wish." Scarlet eyes widened as Naruto seemed to just vanish out of thin air. Quickly standing with some struggle, Alucard willed his hand to regenerate. Then he felt a slight tug before he heard Naruto's voice from behind him, causing him to look behind him, only for his eyes to dilate when he saw what was in both of Naruto's hands. It was his arms. Coolly glancing at behind him, Naruto just crushed the two limbs once again, causing them to be absorbed into his body. He ignored the widening of Alucard's eyes as Naruto slowly walked toward him as he merely rose an eyebrow. "Is that it? Simple regeneration. If this is all you can do, then truly you are nothing more than a mere bug." As the shock pressed down the pain from losing his two limbs, Alucard's eyes narrowed hatefully, although with a bit of apprehension. Willing his limbs to grow back, he jumped back a few feet from Naruto before he drew his sword from its sheath, before he willed his yokai into the blade, causing it to glow red. But soon a mass of tentacles sprouted forth from the guard of the blade before they wrapped around the blade, causing the red glow to turn purple. "You won't catch me off guard this time," and thus Alucard vanished, but Naruto just closed his eyes awaiting for the next move to be played. As Alucard appeared at his left with his blade in mid-swing, and he glanced toward his enemy's face only to see Naruto just glance his way, causing the vampire's eyes to widen. Boom. Dracul Castle, Akasha's room. Emerald eyes snapped open when she suddenly felt her room tremble. Quickly getting up, the vampiress looked for any signs of attack until she felt something in the air. The first she felt was the yokai of her master, which caused her to feel relief, but the second one caused the young girl to scrunch her face up in disgust. This yokai was vile, rotten, and so disgusting it was nearly overwhelming. Sensing the colliding yokai, she ran to her windows only to see in front of the castle was where once the forest, now dead, but the most shocking thing was the fact that behind her master, she saw the ground upheaved as if it's something the ground so hard it caused it to rise. But what really shocked her was the giant upheaval trench going for about 3 miles, well and 3 feet in width. She looked for the cause of it, only to see that the man giving off the vile yokai held a sword wrapped in from what she could see was tentacles. But it had been stopped by her master's hand, causing her blink surprisingly. She knew her master was strong, but to actually stop a blade with enough power to cause that kind of shockwave was surprising to say the least. Then suddenly she felt a familiar presence appear at her side, causing her to glance to her side to see Frankenstein at her side looking from the window himself, but then he spoke something that caused her to gaze at the battle below with her undivided attention. "Watch, princess, and behold just a sliver of our master's power," he said in a tone he rarely ever used, and doing just that, Akasha kept her gaze fixated solely on the battle. But Naruto. Alucard's eyes were wide in complete disbelief. He had put all he had in that swing, and yet this man, this vampire, had stopped it with only his hand without even the slightest injury. What the hell was he fighting? No, the better question was, what the hell had he gotten himself into? "Why do you hesitate?" Flinching, he looked up to see Naruto's cold eyes bearing down on him with all the force of an empathetic god. He couldn't move nor breathe as Naruto lightly touched the blade, causing it to crack and shatter. He could do nothing as the pieces fell to the ground, whilst Naruto's hand merely passed by his defenses and landed exactly where his heart was located. "I could rip out your heart if I so please. Perhaps I should make you eat your own beating heart?" he asked, but suddenly Alucard saw but a glimpse of something that truly terrified him to the core. It was Naruto's face. It was but a mere glimpse, yet he saw his stoic, emotionless visage was replaced with one of pure darkness, with glowing smoky red eyes, with a grin of razor-sharp black fangs. Its demented expression sent chills down his spine and a deep primal fear the likes of which he had never felt before. The demons he had gorged within him screamed in terror, and his blood ran cold at the sheer sight of it. Then it disappeared, and the vampire soon discovered he was hyperventilating as he gazed up into the eyes of Naruto, and just as he regained his senses, he jumped back while gripping the remains of his blade. His eyes glowed crimson before the hilt of his sword exploded, his flesh shifted more quickly whilst his fangs grew in length. "I don't know what you are, but you won't kill me. I won't allow it. I won't allow it." And rearing back his head, Alucard let loose a scream. Braig. That scream soon turned guttural and demonic before Alucard's body soon started to grow in size and girth. His face grew as his flesh started to boil. Then it happened. Splurg. Alucard's entire body split open, causing a massive fountain of blood spray out, but this caused letting a giant mass of tentacles to burst forth. The massive tentacles grew in before a multiple head started to form from within the mass. Soon multiple heads reared their crimson side on Naruto before its mouths grinned, showing multiple jaws of razor-sharp fangs. Then they let loose a roar that caused the entire landscape to shudder. The wind blew past the stoic Naruto that just caused his hair to billow in the wind as his stoic eyes just stared upon the giant abomination of tentacles and flesh of multiple demons within. He showed not a hint of fear as the giant mass stood towering above him. Then he just raised his hand and wiped off some dirt from his shoulder. He gave a small sigh. I guess congratulations are in order, you've upgraded yourself from a mere bug to a cockroach. He said, which seemed to just anger the massive demon flesh even more. Raig. His eyes opened to show icy cold azure slitted orbs staring at the pitiful waste of flesh before him, then he just raised his hand. Now let me end your wretched pitiful existence. Then with a mere flick of his finger, he spoke just as the blood that surrounded the giant mass started to swirl. Tsueki Tatsumaki, and before the mass of demonic flesh could even comprehend what he had just said, it found its entire vision blanketed in red. Vroom. The cause was the fact the blood surrounding it had swirled around it before it became a giant blood-red tornado. Its roars of agony echoed across the landscape but were simply ignored as Naruto watched impassively as the pathetic excuse of a vampire, now reduced to a mere cockroach, screech in horrendous pain, die slowly and painfully. The punishment befitting a wretched yokai that called itself a vampire. Pathetic. Turning away, he flicked his finger again, cancelling the technique, causing the blood to dissipate into the air, revealing one stood a towering giant mass of flesh and bone. Was nothing more than a giant puddle of blood, which it and the blood in the air slowly started to head toward Naruto's way, and as it seeped into his body, he let the impurities begin to purge, and as the blood was all collectively inside his body, he let out a sigh. It seems I was mistaken, your durability was less than that of a cockroach, pitiful. Thus he walked away, leaving the battleground to head back inside his castle. Dracul Castle with Akasha. Akasha's eyes couldn't have gotten any bigger than they already were, but who could blame her? She had just witnessed something unprecedented, the fact that a being who felt like a vampire just turned into a giant flesh ball of multiple heads and mouths was one thing, but she had felt the extreme amount of potent power in that being, and it honestly startled her. Then she began to worry for her master, but her admiration for him grew when she saw him standing up to the monster without a shred of fear. That same admiration grew into awe when she saw him merely whipped out his hand with only a flick of his finger, and 2 words summoned a giant tornado created by the blood on the battlefield, which afterwards completely engulfed the abomination. And in just a few short seconds the blood vanished to reveal nothing but a giant puddle of blood. And that, princess, is but a morsel of what our master can do. Burn this into your eyes and let what you saw be forever absorbed into your mind. This is merely part of what a true vampire can do, so keep at heart that our master wishes only the best of you so that you can achieve this level of power one day. Frankenstein said, and to his relief he saw Akasha dumbly nodded as she was still fixated on the side as her mind replaced the scene over and overwhelming. Naruto-sama is so amazing. Now Akasha was sure of one thing: she was deeply honored to have been taken under his wing and would forever follow him even until their student-teacher relationship came to an end. She would forever be at his side, and come high water or hell or the forces of heaven, she would be there serving him the best way she could. A few days later, Naruto's study. Naruto's eyes scanned the contents of the parchment in his hand with an impassive expression. It's been a few days with his little scuffle with the vampire called Alucard, and already it seemed news had been spreading of the battle. Though no one had seen it, he supposed the spies of the council had been near to feel the conflicting yokai and reported it to them directly. And they had been rather discreet, but they had sent him a recommendation of the council which he was allowed to use on whatever he wished that was within their power. Though he didn't see use in it, as he could extract any information he so desired from them, since it was in the agreement he made with them. Nonetheless, he would keep it should he ever need it. But surely the news would spread from some loose lips, and soon all of Machi would know, and though that didn't bother him, he didn't want the publicity that came with it. It was just downright annoying. However, as he rubbed his chin and thought perhaps he could use this new bout of fame to good use. But then there were the last parts of the parchment that made him frown, for it was the first mission given to him by the council, which was to go out and exterminate rogue vampires that were threatening the local borders of the Kitsun clan that held a shaky alliance with the vampires of this era. Which was foolish, seeing as in his time his race and the Kitsun were deeply tied in an alliance, as he respected the race as a whole, and their leader was not one to be taken lightly. Shaking his head, Naruto put the parchment away and intertwined his hands together as his mind went on to other matters. Among them was the progress Akasha was showing lately. Usually she always showed vast amounts of improvement, but after his fight with Alucard, she showed an even deeper urge to become stronger, and the drive she had seemed to only become more powerful. The rate she improved since then was quite honestly astronomical in scale. However, this proposed a problem for Naruto, and that was one thing. Akasha needed a sparring partner that could keep up with her, because her sparring against Frankenstein wouldn't improve upon her abilities to adapt. She needed someone that could equal her in power and drive her even more to become stronger. Deciding to get this mission over with, he glanced toward Frankenstein. "Frankenstein, stay here and watch over Akasha's training for me. I will be back." He looked toward his servant, who gave a nod before he vanished. Outskirts of the Ural Mountains with Naruto. Naruto sighed as he walked away from the site of what was once the rebel base of the Rouge vampires, which was now completely dead. He didn't feel the need to use his powers on such weak scum of his fallen race, and so he only used his natural if suppressed speed, strength and reflexes to defeat the group. Dealing with them swiftly, but brutally he had done as asked so to keep the alliance with the Kitsune steady. Still Naruto felt something a bit off ever since he came here, and when he was about to leave back to his castle, that feeling only grew when he heard something nearby. Deciding to investigate, he vanished following where the sound originated. Humming to the source, he trailed behind a rogue vampire running away from the battle, but held in his arms was something that caught Naruto's eye. For it looked like a kitsune child from what he could see by the three tails however behind that he couldn't see. Letting one escape however was not on his list, and deciding to act he did so. Raising his hand he flicked his middle finger. Then the vampire screamed as his left was instantly blown to pieces by an unseeable force and was instantly sent face down into the ground, thus dropping the kitsune child, but Naruto paid no attention as he just appeared above the vampire. Grasping the vampire by the scruff of his neck, he gazed coldly at the vampire who struggled in his grip. When his eyes saw Naruto, his struggles got even more erratic. "No. Not you, let me go. Let me go, you monster." Ignoring his cries, Naruto leaned down and sunk his fangs into the vampire's neck, cutting even further cries. He sucked the blood out of his victim, who soon went limp before his skin turned gray and shriveled up as his eyeballs sunk into their sockets, and with one last gasp the vampire died in his hands. Nodding, Naruto let go of the husk, which as soon as it hit the ground exploded into ash. Satisfied with this, Naruto turned his gaze on the kitsune child that was trying to desperately crawl away. What he saw however caused his eyes to widen ever so briefly, for what he saw was indeed a kitsune child, but just a little girl possibly the same age as Akasha. She had long red-maroon hair with apprehensive violet eyes that stared back at him. Her skin was a tad paler than normal kitsune, but then again from what Naruto sensed this child was not a normal kitsune. Not by any means. His eyes narrowed when he felt her yokai, and his eyes glowed for the slightest moment. "So you did have a descendant, Inari. One to inherit your blessings." "Ayano, sir." The child's voice caused him to blink before he looked back at the child who fidgeted under his gaze. "Yes, what is it, child?" he asked, causing the young girl to gain a bit more strength in her next words. "Arigato, for saving me," she said, causing Naruto just give a nod, but his interest in the girl was increasing every second. To believe that a child of Inari had existed in this day and age was something to be surprised about. He hadn't ever came upon one in his time, but he could feel the power locked away in the child and knew by the essence that she carried the power of Inari. How was very simple, he had met with Inari numerous times and had come to recognize the kitsune deity's power and essence long ago. "You're welcome, child." He spoke, causing the young girl to smile before she looked down as she toyed with the rim of her shirt. She was after all in the presence of a vampire she heard about from her clansmen, so it was understandable that she was nervous. However, as Naruto looked at the young girl, his face morphed into a frown as memories of the ones he killed came flooding back to him. What he saw was disheartening to say the least, as it seemed the child was taken by the rogue vampires, who were in fact agents sent by the council to the Kitsune borderlands to steal the child and blame it upon werewolves, thereby to instigate a war between the two while strengthening the council and attaining the young girl in the process. They must be wanting her as well, but they don't seem to know of her special status. This could work to my advantage. Then he knelt down by the girl, causing her to flinch, and given the situation of her kidnapping, it was to be expected. However, when she saw no ill intent in her savior's eyes, she relaxed her posture just slightly. She saw him extend his hand to her as he gave her a small smile. "Where are your parents, young one?" he asked, causing the girl to look down with a pained expression on her face. "My parents were said to have died when I was just a newborn," she said, causing Naruto to nod, though he could sense there was more to it than that. "Who's been taking care of you then?" he prodded, causing her to grasp her shoulder as her eyes narrowed in anger, causing Naruto's eyebrow to perk in interest. "I've been in the care of the Kitsune shamans, but all they ever did was train me to become a good Kitsune, and they punished me severely for the smallest thing or never living up to their standards. So if you call that raising me, then sure," she said in spite, and though she didn't want to sound hateful to her savior, just remembering those old bastards caused her to want to rip out their throats. Keeping his eye on the girl, Naruto contemplated on what she said. It seemed the Kitsune shamans at least had an idea that the girl was indeed very special, but they didn't seem to realize how precious she was to their race. However, this showed him an opportunity, as their negligence and mental abuse had caused this young girl's loyalty to her clan to drift apart. "I see, then how about this, would you like to come with me?" he asked, causing the girl's eyes to snap in his direction in surprise before they glazed over with distrust. "And why should I? How can I know you won't treat me any differently?" she shouted, but Naruto just kept his calm facade whilst he just raised his hand. Because I swear on my pride and honor as a vampire, unlike these lowly savages that took you, but a true vampire. I will take you to a place where you don't have to feel like the slightest mistake will warrant unjustified punishment. I will raise you and train you to the best of my ability. He said, causing the girl's mental defenses to slowly crack, but she held strong, despite the urge to cry became apparent. And why would you help me? She said in a barely audible whisper, but Naruto kept his eyes solely on hers, which held completely honesty. Because I see a young girl whose treatment is holding her back from becoming what she is meant to be. I see a girl whose potential is so high that it can dwarf the kitsune of this day and age any other kitsune that's been born throughout history. Only if she's ready to take that step to unlock that potential. What say you, child? He watched as the girl struggled before he blinked when he saw tears fall from her eyes. Biting her lower lip, he watched the young girl look down to hide her tears, but her next words caused his eyes to glow in approval. She looked back up, and despite her tears she held a heartfelt smile. I will come with you. I have no other place to go, nor do I belong anywhere. No one wants me, and I would like to know what it feels like to be wanted. She said, then her violet eyes widened when she suddenly felt Naruto's hand on top of her head. His fingers caressing the top of her head while barely touching her fox ears, causing her suppress the urge to purr, but she could not stop her cheeks from glowing crimson. She glanced up through her crimson bangs to see the azure orbs of her savior looking back down at her. Remember, child, if you choose to come with me you must faithfully serve me in return for me to train you. Are you still willing? He asked, but the girl just smiled even bigger, causing it to look a bit foxy. I've never been more sure of anything, Dadabane. She said, causing his eyes to glow in amusement. This girl was amusing. I see, then let me introduce myself. My name is Dracul Naruto. May I know the name of my new servant? He asked respectively, causing the young girl to twiddle her fingers shyly before she spoke her name. My name is Uzumaki Kushina, my master, she said. On that day Naruto would never realize his life was going to change with the addition to his castle, even more so in the future. So this part ends here. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, so quickly like this video for second part of this series. And comment down below your thoughts about this series. And now it's time for me to go, bye.